The air tasted like salt and machine oil when the first pale band of April 1st, 1945 lifted over Yontan airfield. PFC Danny Cole kept one knee in the dew and one hand on his handset, the rubber cup hot already against his ear. LST engines idled offshore in a bass murmur, and gulls cut slow figure eights above tanks nosing through surf as if the Pacific were just another muddy creek. No banshee wail, no beach banzai, only the click of safeties and the soft, orderly curses of wire teams unreeling line toward the gun pits. A corporal tugged Danny's sleeve and pointed, Kaisishima, a smudge on the horizon, where lanterns would have bobbed over 155mm long tom crews preparing registration fires. "They're setting the clock," the corporal said. "We just keep time." Lieutenant Helen H.D. Drake, Navy Gunfire Liaison, moved along the row of crouched Marines like a conductor, mill grids and watch times in her breast pocket, voice level when she checked nets with the destroyer screen. 5-inch 38 standing by for call for, a tinny voice crackled back. She acknowledged, then told Danny, "You'll hear splash 5 seconds before the sea stands up." He laughed because the sea looked calm as a sleeping dog. In the south, the island rose in a rumple of ridges the maps called Kakazu, Maida, Shuri. On paper, those lines were polite. In limestone, they were teeth. Inside a cave south of Shuri Castle, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, operations officer of the 32nd Army, would have traced a finger along his scheme of defence. Hold fire, fortify the reverse slopes, let the Americans flood the plain. Beach heroics waste shells. Attrition was his mathematics. He knew his artillery, Type 89 15cm guns, Type 90-75s, and the precious 50mm grenade dischargers could not trade salvo for salvo. He meant to trade time. The first American probes stepped forward and found only wind, grass, and tombs. Danny tasted the sweet grit of crushed coral when a bulldozer sneezed and Seabees cut a turnout big enough for a 6-gun battery to swing. The 105mm M2 howitzers came alive in their revetments with the specific clank of trails biting, the breech ring shining like a clean tooth. HD lifted her wrist and began to speak in a cadence that felt less like war than like factory work. Target identification, observer target line, correction in mills, time of flight. The sea stayed flat. The island breathed in. He swallowed and waited for the moment when it would breathe out steel. The crate bucked under the weight of acetate and rain when HD unrolled the plastic-covered fire plan and drew a grease pencil circle around a knuckled slope near Kakazu. Danny read the symbols as if they were a new alphabet. TRPS, target reference points, numbered down the ridge. FPF, final protective fires, like electric fences ready to hum. A dashed arc where a destroyer could lay a 5-inch curtain to comb the crest. Shift from known point able, left 30, add 150, HD said into the net. Danny relayed, pencil stub tapping the edge of the crate in a nervous metronome. The first call for fire was adjust fire over, the gentlest way of asking a battery to wake. 6 105mm M2s answered with the cough of powder bags and the wet slap of recoil. A spotter, likely in a tiny liaison plane with fabric wings that seemed insolent in this weather, walked the burst up the slope with corrections in mills. Drop 20, right 15. HD keyed the destroyer. VT fuses, open ground, 2 rounds, battery, she said, explaining to Danny as she worked that a variable time fuse sensed the earth and burst above men instead of in it. He thought of rain clouds, learning to think. Under their boots, wire teams had laced the plane to the fire direction centres, where slide rules and range tables turned words into quadrant elevation and deflection. In the gun pits, assistant gunners spun hand wheels until white paint marks kissed. Numbers made physics obedient. Time on target, HD said quietly, as if to herself, and then aloud. Batteries Baker through Fox, staggered firing times, splash together. Mark. He watched the ridge through his binoculars and saw nothing, and then saw everything at once. The crest jittered, a line of tomb eaves flickered, and a white seam ripped down a gully. The destroyer's 5-inch stitched the far slope like a zipper. Smoke crawled out of caves like exhausted lungs. Later, men would walk up there and find trenches shaved clean, machine gun tripods snapped as if by petulant gods. For now, the map looked like a calm sheet of plastic, and the only proof it killed was the way the air pressed into his chest. "Lift in 5, HD sang, and the guns obeyed, silent just long enough for the infantry to rise and move. The rain returned in thin needles, drawing chalk lines down their helmets. Danny licked limestone from his teeth and realized the acetate was a factory blueprint. It wasn't poetry. It was a work order with blood attached. In a farmhouse south of Shuri, Ishikawa Mitsuko dipped her brush, counted her students, and marked the roll on a scrap of paper that would later serve as a prayer. The thunder far away was not weather yet. It was the sound of distant men getting ready. When the first shells passed like invisible trains high overhead, registration shots likely from Long Tom's on Kaisishima, she closed the shutters and led the children toward the family tomb, cool air smelling of incense and wet limestone. In the half-light, the little ones whispered about the Americans, whether they carried candy like the rumours said, whether ships could make the sea burn. Yahara's doctrine made the island hold its breath. He would cede the flat country, trade ground for blood, and make the Americans pay interest on every yard with counter-attacks from prepared positions. His gunners husbanded shells as if they were heirloom coins, Type 89 15-centimetre cannons moved by night, mortar ammunition counted in handfuls. Scarcity was a tactic and a fate. They could not answer every call. They would answer the right one and hope the right one mattered. On the plain, the Americans multiplied their arithmetic. Seabees knocked coral into roads and turnouts so ammunition trucks could feed the gun line. Class 5 depots swelled until the stacks of 105mm HE looked like grain elevators. Wire crews strung line like spider silk, so if radios washed out in rain, the net would still hum. The 7th, 27th, 77th and 96th Infantry Divisions shook out beside the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, all under the 10th Army's umbrella. From offshore, destroyers and cruisers practiced their own punctuation on empty slopes to proof the math. Mitsuko would have traded a handful of sweet potatoes for aspirin and settled for boiled water. The children pressed their ears against the stone and tried to hear the war move. When she returned to the house for a blanket, she found a wrapper under a windowsill, the English letters melted into a bronze skin by the humidity. She pocketed the ring of paper like a relic. By then, the island had inhaled as far as it could. The ledger the Americans kept said something that would sound impossible if she ever read it. Before this campaign ended, more than 1,105mm shells would be fired into these ridges. One caliber, one family of guns, a number so large it felt like a fable told to children to keep them still. The wind shifted, and the smell of powder dust came on like rain. She counted the children again. Somewhere, a whistle blew. Night along Kaisishima smelled of diesel, wet canvas, and the metallic sweetness of fresh powder bags. Lanterns were hooded, voices thumbed down to murmurs, and yet the 155mm guns seemed to speak in a language you could feel in your ribs. The Long Tom's crews moved like machinists at a third-shift plant. Shell carts whispering on planks. A rammer's padded fist sending 100 pounds of HE into a steel throat. Breech blocks swinging shut with clean, oily clicks. A sergeant would have called cadence softly. Charge 5, fuse quick, quadrant 332. And a gun captain would have checked the elevation bubble the way a banker checks a ledger. HD stood beside the liaison radio with her headset cocked, one finger on her watch crown. Counter battery was the game tonight. Find the Japanese pieces that had the insolence to bark and quiet them so thoroughly their crews would taste dirt. A grasshopper circled inland, a fabric-winged speck riding a thread of starlight, the pilot calling out a single muzzle flash that winked like a firefly. "Mark that," HD said, and the fire direction centre behind her muttered the math that would make geography flinch: time of flight, wind, propellant temperature, drift. On the plane, Danny lay with his handset tucked under his helmet to keep the rain off, listening to a symphony he could not see. He imagined the shells arcing so high they got cold, the stars checking their papers as they passed. The order went battery, battalion, battalion, staggered firing times so that what left at different seconds would arrive together. Time on target is a paradox you accept with your bones. When the salvo hit, the night flickered inland, a sallow pulse and a ridgeline sighed as if exhaling smoke. The Japanese gunners were not amateurs. They would have dragged their pieces by hand to alternate positions and used flashless powder when they could get it. Ammunition was a private treasure. A platoon might carry it the way a family carries jewelry during a fire. Yahara's notes would later record the exchange rate with a kind of gentleman's despair. The Americans fired as if the magazines were oceans. The islands could not drink enough to lower the tide. Smoke drifted seaward as the long toms settled into a steady thump and recoil, the rhythm of a factory press turning ore into conclusions. HD checked her watch again and said almost kindly, "Lift 10 seconds," and the guns eased their muzzles like horses tossing heads. The sea lay black and patient. On the horizon, a destroyer pivoted, ready to write its own sentence in 5-inch commas. The staff tent glowed like a jarred firefly, blackout slits throwing thin yellow blades onto puddles. HD pinned a fresh sheet to the board and drew columns as clean as parade ground stripes. Caliber, number of rounds, mission type. The pencil ticked forward by the hour, and the numbers went from tidy to biblical. A week's ordinary day gave you multiple thousands of 105mm high explosive, hundreds of 155mm counter battery, companies of 4.2-inch smoke to blind a ridge long enough for men to move. Danny came in with a bandolier of fuses over one shoulder and rained down both sleeves, and he stopped just inside the flap like a man walking into a cathedral. "We'll run out of pencils before we run out of shells," someone said, not joking. Out at an ammo point, the stacks looked like elevator shafts tipped sideways, crates of 105mm shells and powder cans rising into the dark. Forklifts complained. A corporal with hands like wrenches checked lot numbers because powder temperature mattered and fuses had tempers when damp. Seabees had gravelled the approaches so trucks didn't sink to their axles, and in the rain the whole place steamed faintly as if the earth itself were brewing coffee. None of this was improvisation. It was procedure marching on schedule. A destroyer called in for a shore correction. Down 20, right 15. And HD passed it without looking up from the board. Someone had chalked a small box in the corner for running totals, and as the days pooled into a fortnight, the tally of 105mm alone rose to a figure that would have made a clerk look for a misplaced comma. Numbers this big changed your posture. They suggested that what was happening outside the tent was not chaos, but policy. Translated enemy diaries filtered through like postcards from a parallel war. A Japanese infantryman wrote that when his side fired one round, 10 came back. The ratio was not a boast. It was a thermometer stuck in the fever of an army. Yahara's formal memoranda were cooler in tone, but pointed at the same cliff. Scarcity as a tactic had become scarcity as destiny. You cannot bleed a factory. Danny glanced at the corner box and then at the door flap where rain stitched the night. He thought of the Hershey bar he had not yet eaten. He thought of the men on the ridges who would rise on the lift of a barrage and move because the numbers said the seconds were safe. HD added another hash and said almost gently, "This is how you end fortresses." Water tapped the cave mouth like patient fingers as Yahara traced the damp outline of the Shuri sector on a field map that had gone soft at the folds. His doctrine, husband shells, trade ground, draw blood slowly, had been the only arithmetic a poor army could respect. But the Americans solved problems with arrival times. At dawn, a monsoon-grey HD aligned watch crowns across batteries and destroyers, and a ridge ceased to be a place and became a schedule. The infantry would have stepped off not at a bugle, but at H-30 seconds from a lift computed by men hunched over range tables, and that was the steely romance of this war, anonymous mathematics making courage survivable. On the plain, Danny pressed his cheek to wet limestone and watched a smoke curtain walk down a slope the way a janitor draws a mop line across a floor. HE quick for men in the open, HE delay for cave mouths, VT to burst over the gullies where counterattacks boiled. The net hummed with brevity words, splash, repeat, negative, and in between the static he could hear CB graders somewhere whining as they armoured the roads against the coming flood. If radios faded, wire took over. If trucks bogged, destroyers took the mission. Everything had a second engine. Mitsuko moved her class deeper into the tomb when the first ceiling rocks ticked loose. She counted heads by touch. In the candle's splice of light, a child's hand found a melted chocolate square in a pocket and broke it into communion. Sweetness has a smell even through cordite. She told them a story about rain that would keep bad men away. It was not a lie, not exactly. Yahara wrote, likely that evening, the sentence that conceded what statistics already shouted, "We cannot burn down their arsenal." He did not surrender skill or bravery. He surrendered the premise that will could outweigh a factory. The impossible number took flesh in the rain. The campaign would drive ground artillery expenditures past 2 million rounds, more than 1 million of those the humble 105mm, that family of guns whose breech clanked like a door to a familiar room. Add hundreds of thousands of naval shells, and the sum became a weather system. On HD's board, the rows and columns fattened until they resembled topography. "Lift in 5, she said, and the guns exhaled. Danny rose with the line, legs wooden, and stepped into the seconds that had been purchased for him by women riveting in Cleveland and men stoking boilers on grey ships. The ridge ahead blurred into a schedule he could keep. Sugarloaf was smaller than the maps promised, a chipped tooth in the coral jaw, slick with rain and the sweat of men who had tried it yesterday and failed. Danny lay in the lee of a broken tomb and listened to the company commander talk to fire direction in a voice that might have been ordering lunch. HD was 2 ridgelines back, headset pressed tight, watching watch hands. The order had gone out at first light to make the ridge conform to the schedule. Preparatory fires, smoke, lift, advance. Repeat until the stone learned manners. You could smell the wet powder even before the first reports reached you, a clean metallic sweetness that got into your mouth and stayed there like a coin. The battery line behind them came alive as if a switch had been thrown. 6 guns, then 12, then what sounded like all the artillery in the world, though Danny knew it was only the battalions assigned for the time on target. The corrections came thin and clipped. Right 15, drop 20, repeat, and the ridge shook in pulses that coordinated with his heartbeat. HE quick shaved the crest. HE delay bit the mouths of caves. A curtain of smoke started at the summit and walked itself down a spur like a man in a grey coat taking deliberate steps. On the far flank, a destroyer stitched a 5-inch zipper along a reverse slope. The timing was the point. HD had stacked firing times so that what left different guns at messy intervals arrived together, a door slamming across stone. In that brief quiet between the last salvo and the first step, Danny tasted the brass on his tongue and knew that if they moved exactly when the clock said, the seconds would belong to them. The order came, up, and they rose into a world recalculated by mathematics. The Japanese countered the way brave men always do. At night, in rain, by paths the shells missed. They rolled knee mortars from alcoves and fired 2 rounds like questions, then shifted by hand to live until dawn. A squad came at the left in a thin grey line and vanished in the standing smoke, and the platoon sergeant called for FPF as if he were ordering coffee refills. The guns obeyed, the slope's skin pebbled, then smoothed, then went very quiet. When the sun should have been high, the clouds turned the day to pewter, and the ridge looked a finger shorter. Marines crawled where men had run and found machine gun tripods snapped, drums of ammunition polished by concussion, a cooking pot half full of rain. Danny crawled beside a crater lip and touched coral that flaked like scabbed glass. He did not cheer. He checked his watch. The next lift was in 3 minutes, and the island's stubborn tooth would have to be ground again. The rain began as a rumour and arrived like a decree. By the morning of 21st May, the sky had lowered until it rested on helmets, and every depression turned to a mirror. Trucks that had seemed unstoppable the week before now bayed and slid like tired oxen, and powder cans hissed when you cracked them, a kettle sound that made old gunners superstitious. HD pulled a tarp over the map board and stapled the edges down with a pocket knife, then shifted her priorities around the weather like a quartermaster moving crates. Ships would carry more of the day's weight, guns with better drainage would take the heavier missions, and any schedule that did not respect the sky would be replaced by one that did. Seabees showed up like myth. They dropped corduroy in the worst stretches, crushed coral until it flowed like gravel, and laid turnouts that let ammo trucks nose past one another without syncing up to their differentials. Danny walked beside a deuce and a half to keep it honest, water to his shins and the driver counting gears like prayers. At the ammo point, the stacks steamed, rain beating tattoos on tarps, and a corporal with a pencil behind his ear checked lot numbers with the concentration of a surgeon. Powder temperature mattered, fuses had moods when damp. The miracle was not that it worked once, it was that it worked again at 1400, and again at 1700, and again in the black. Out to sea, destroyers settled into the work with the relief of men who have their footing. 5-inch mounts spoke with that clipped factory rhythm, spotting corrections flowing from shore like advice from an older sibling. HD traded missions between ship and shore so the fire never blinked. Battery has roadblock, someone said on the net, and she slid a cruiser onto the problem like a paperweight on a map corner. The ridges took the beating without commentary. Rain made the falls of shot look polite. In the tomb, Mitsuko added names to her roll by touch, counting heads while the cave dripped like a clock. A child coughed again, and she bartered a square of chocolate for a sip of quinine that tasted like a machine shop. She told them the rain was a friend, that it would keep bad men away. Outside, bad and good blurred into wet, and the only question that mattered was whether the ammunition would arrive in time to make courage survivable. It did. The throughput numbers never looked heroic in a ledger, just tonnage per day and rounds per tube per 24 hours, but they held even as the sky broke. The orchestra played through the storm because democracy had built it to play in any weather, and because men with wrenches and shovels and slide rules believed the schedule was the nearest thing to mercy the battlefield would ever know. The message travelled faster than the rain. Lieutenant General Buckner, killed by artillery, June 18th. For a moment the tent sounded like nothing, as if the storm had taken even the noise away. Danny stood in the doorway with water running off his helmet and felt the strange stillness that follows a single, well-aimed fact. Then the board clicked forward again. Lifts were timed, missions assigned, the gun line humming because the machine was bigger than one man. HD swallowed once, touched 2 watch crowns into agreement, and said, "Execute," as if the syllables themselves bore weight. Out along the Shuri line, the enemy's geometry began to fray. Positions that had existed all spring, names that had entered the language of the battalions like curses and hometowns, went pale and then vanished from the map, erased not by inspiration but by scheduled violence. Yahara ordered withdrawals with a surgeon's economy, saving men where he could, shifting guns by night to second positions and then to third. But the seconds the Americans owned were eating the minutes he needed. When a knee mortar popped like a hiccup, counter-battery answered within a breath. Civilians began to come out of the dark, Cave roofs failed, food ran thin, and the weather that had hidden the brave also suffocated the weak. Mitsuko led the children up a trench where every fern was black with powder soot and lined them on a berm to count them again, because numbers had become the only safety spell anyone trusted. She could not name all the losses. She could only mark the living. By then, the tallies had swollen into something that would sound like boasting if it were not so carefully kept. Ground artillery alone had fired on the order of 2 million rounds, more than 1 million of those the workhorse 105mm. Naval guns had written their own hundreds of thousands into the ledger, 5-inch to 16-inch, every diameter a dialect of the same argument. An enemy diary had put it plainer, for every one of ours, 10 of theirs. The impossible had become routine. The net did not pause for grief. A rolling barrage moved like a sidewalk across 3 ridges, lifting at H-30 seconds, 15, 5, and then becoming silence just long enough for men to stand up and be brave. Danny checked his handset, checked his watch, and thought of the Hershey bar he still hadn't eaten. He had planned to save it for a celebration. What he had instead was a schedule that would end a line and then another and then the war. The war slowed enough at the edge to hear the pencils. In the staff space, the air smelled of damp paper and graphite dust, and the boards were layered like sedimentary rock. Today's fires laid over yesterday's, the sum turning topography into arithmetic. HD read off final campaign figures while a clerk followed with a ruler. Ground guns had hurled roughly 2 million and a few tens of thousands of rounds, more than half of them 105mm. Naval gunfire added hundreds of thousands of shells 5 inches and larger, the sea's handwriting over the armies. The words did not try to be dramatic. The numbers were their own adjectives. Danny listened with the pleasure of a mechanic hearing an engine he rebuilt idle smooth. He knew what those columns had felt like from the mud, the way a time on target could turn stone to weather in a handful of seconds, the way smoke became a privacy screen that made living possible. The clerk called out average time from call to splash, minutes that would have been a page in a manual turned into lives sustained, and the room nodded without smiling. Procedure had done what heroics alone could not. There were other columns that did not please. Casualty figures took their places with a formality that felt like church. The US tallies were heavy, the Navy's losses at sea written in a smaller hand that made them seem more intimate. The Japanese dead were a cliff. Civilian counts came with ranges and footnotes, careful because certainty is a luxury in ruins. HD touched the chalk to the edge of that box and let the line trail off. Not every number belongs to victory. She turned to the logistics, because victory had lived there most of the time. Tonnage per day across beaches that had to become ports, numbers of gun tubes available by week, mean rounds per tube in a 24-hour cycle. When a figure rose, you could tell a road had been laid or a ferry slip had found its rhythm. When it dipped, you could hear a storm landing on canvas. The orchestra metaphor returned not because they liked it, but because it was true. Sections queuing sections, percussion closing ranks when woodwinds faltered. The meeting adjourned with the odd quiet of men leaving a library. Outside, the gun line lay idle for the first time in memory, tubes cooling to a dark that felt almost human. Danny stood where the board's light did not quite reach and understood the most comforting truth the numbers could offer. None of this had been excess. It had been design, a democracy's habit of making schedules and then keeping them with steel. A new map lay on the table, the home islands drawn like a string of vertebrae. Kyushu circled in a red grease pencil that bled in the humidity. The arrows that had once looked like ambition now read like a conveyor plan. Okinawa had answered a question the planners had asked only in theory. Could an army, fed across an ocean, sustain industrialized precision at the edge of the world? The boards in the next tent had replied in columns and totals. Yes and yes again, at a cost written both in brass and names. American staff officers ran projections off the Okinawa rates because numbers, not adjectives, carry forward. If one island required so many tons per day, so many rounds per tube, so many destroyer days on the gun line, then Kyushu would demand multiples that bent pencils. The arithmetic did not tremble, it simply expanded. Men in shirt sleeves compared railheads to beaches, airfields to schedules, and concluded with a calm that sounded like fatalism that the machine could run hot enough, long enough to crush any fortress that stood to meet it. Across the ruined ridges, Yahara wrote retrospective sentences that read like verdicts without bitterness. He had not misjudged courage or the utility of caves and reverse slopes. He had misjudged the enemy's ability to turn payrolls, blueprints, and rail cars into a weather system. If an island of 18 miles could absorb more than 2 million ground-fired shells and stay on the schedule that fed them, what would the home islands look like under that sky? He had the honesty to see it and the grace to say it aloud. At sea, the fleet counted its losses. Ships sunk and damaged under the storm of suicide planes, escorts patched and put back into the line because leaving the gun line was not an option so long as men ashore were waiting on schedules. The fact of their persistence was not poetry, it was policy. The lesson of the campaign was not that America loved fire. It was that America had taught itself how to apply it with the regularity of payroll and whistle. Danny packed his gear with the sullen care of a man folding up a job he has done too long. HD slipped a slide rule into her map case the way a teacher saves a piece of chalk. They understood what the arrows on the Kyushu map meant and also what the numbers had already done to the premise of those arrows. A hand set a paperweight on the plan. The arrows did not move, but the room had learned to read them in a different tense. Twilight came soft to a scraped ridge, and for the first time in months the air smelled more of wet stone than of cordite. Danny sat on an ammo crate gone silver with use and took the Hershey bar from his pocket as if it were a letter. Mitsuko brought the children up the trench one by one, hands on shoulders, eyes wary and bright. He broke the chocolate into squares and set them on a ration tin the way a chaplain lays out wafers. The smallest boy let his square melt on his tongue and closed his eyes like a man hearing a hymn. HD walked the gun line like a teacher lingering in an empty hallway. The tubes were dark and candid, paint scoured to primer at the muzzles, traversing gears gritty with a campaign's worth of dust. She laid a palm on the breech of a 105 and felt the echo of days when its clank had been the metronome of living. Somewhere offshore, a ship fired a salute, a percussion without malice, and the sound went up into a sky that finally held still. Records would be boxed and shipped home, and in them a statistic that should remain impossible would sit as calmly as a date. Over 2 million rounds from ground artillery in a single campaign, of which more than 1 million were 105mm, plus the hundreds of thousands pounded in from the sea. In factories far away, single shifts had turned out quantities that shamed entire enemy arsenals. Days in the Midwest had produced more fuses than garrisons could hope to see in a season. The arithmetic of a free people had made a weather system out of steel. Yahara composed his analysis with the respect a craftsman gives to a superior tool. He had seen bravery spend itself wisely and still fail. He had watched scarcity masquerade as doctrine and then drop the mask. He offered no alibis. He asked a different question. What kind of nation builds a machine that can throw 1 million shells of one caliber and keep the trains, the schools, and the promise of normal life running at home? The answer was not in a manual. It was in a habit of committees, elections, contracts, and clocks kept honest. Mitsuko folded her attendance roll, tucked it into a book whose cover had come off, and told the children school would open above ground tomorrow. Danny checked his watch without meaning to, and then smiled at his own reflex. HD snapped her map case closed the way a worker clocks out. Freedom had been delivered on time, not by accident and not by romance, but by a republic that learned to make thunder keep a schedule and had the heart to stop it when the lesson was learned.